Welcome to this Academy for Teachers masterclass, No Empires, No Dust Bowls, Lessons from the First Global Environmental Crisis with Professor Hannah Holleman. I'm Annie Kleinbeater and I use she, her pronouns, and I have been teaching science for the past 4 years at Ethical Culture Fieldston School and for much longer in various other settings. I am a huge science nerd and I love to share my nerdy science knowledge with others. And I especially love to share science stories that haven't been traditionally told. I'm also a proud fellow of the Academy for Teachers, an organization that inspires educators to continue to develop their teaching practice through collaboration with one of the best possible resources, other amazing teachers. Today, I have the honor of introducing Professor Hannah Holleman. Professor Holleman is an associate professor of sociology and environmental studies at Amherst College. Her research involves social theory and environmental sociology. Currently, she is studying the environmental movement in the context of COVID in relation to our struggles for racial justice and struggles for indigenous sovereignty. I am beyond excited about today's class. Indigenous sovereignty is an issue that has always been important to me. And now, as a teacher of environmental science, I'm even more excited to learn about how we can empower and learn from Indigenous communities to mitigate the devastating impacts of climate change. Professor Holleman is not the only star of this masterclass. It is also my honor to introduce the 14 teachers here today. This is an impressive group of educators with advanced degrees in creative writing, education, genetics, US history, biology, English literature, teaching, and public health administration. We teach grades 3 through 12 in public schools, charter schools, and independent schools. We teach a range of fascinating subjects from ancient engineering to the cultural history of self-help to history of the Americas and a little bit of everything in between. We also advise a number of extracurricular activities from the particularly timely Remote Gardening Club to Women in STEM, to Animal Squad, to Environmental Club, and more. There's a lot of teaching experience here today. We've been in the classroom between 4 and 25 years. The total number of years we've been teaching is 155. We teach between 50 and 187 kids. The number of children who know our names is 1,452, and that's this year alone. So your real audience today, Professor Holleman, are those 1,452 kids and the 1,400 students we'll have next year, and the following year, and every year beyond that. Because every teacher here will, in some way, share with their students what we learned from you. The ripple effect of this class will be huge. Thank you, Professor Holleman, for being here. Thanks to my fellow teachers for teaching and for everything that you do for your students. And with that, let the masterclass begin. Professor Holleman, I'll now turn it over to you.
Wow, thank you so much, Annie. I'm really glad you didn't tell me how big my audience was before we did this today. I might have been a little worried about it, but thank you so much. So before we start, I wanted to acknowledge that the land I live on is traditional territory of the Nonotuck and Norwottuck people. But as the town I live in and the college where I work is named for one of the most notorious British commanders of the British Army in the French Indian War, Lord Geoffrey Amherst. So Amherst is known for intentionally trading smallpox-infected blankets to regional tribes in order to, in his words, extirpate the race. So this was an early documented instance of germ warfare by the British with genocidal intent. And Lord Jeff, when I arrived at Amherst College, was actually our mascot. So we got rid of Lord Jeff as a mascot just a few years ago, but I have to say that the level of commitment on the part of some of our alumni and some of our students to Lord Jeff as our mascot and the symbol of our school that appeared on all of our gear and so on was really, it was very astonishing to me. I think there was even a New York Times article about it. So like everywhere else in the US, this place has a long and ongoing history that we should always strive to better understand and that we should remember collectively when we gather like this. So In addition to this acknowledgement, I'd like to also thank the organizers of our meeting this afternoon. I know that it takes a lot of behind the scenes work to make something like this possible, and I really appreciate all the effort that went into it and all of the support that I received in communication in planning the class for today. So I really thank you all for that. And I also want to thank all of you for participating and taking time together here today. I know you've already had a long day of work, and this has been an incredible year. And I just really appreciate that it was worth it to you to get together today to talk about how we understand environmental crises like the Dust Bowl and what that means about how we approach, what's necessary to address them. So thank you all so much. And you all, I love getting the bios of all of your work. It's like super impressive and interesting. And it made me wish I could go to school again, because I definitely didn't get to take a lot of the classes as a student that you all teach. So it's pretty awesome. And so I'm really excited to teach with you all, or to talk with you all today, especially as a group, because you're coming from very different disciplinary backgrounds from my own. You also teach, as Annie said, different levels of students and in different institutional contexts, and you live and work across the city in different places. And so given our different disciplinary training, I know that we focus on environmental issues through very different lenses, but I think that's exciting and means we have a lot to share and learn from one another. I actually co-teach our Introduction to Environmental Studies at Amherst College with a plant biologist, Rachel Levin, and I've done this for a number of years. And I have to say that I've learned a lot doing this. I think we really influence the way each other think about things by getting to teach together. And I really see this class as another opportunity like that for me to get to learn from your expertise and hear your thoughts about the issues that come up in my work, and also to share, what I've learned and what I research. So I really appreciate this opportunity, and it's nice to see people doing so many different kinds of work. So my idea for this week is that we reserve the time we have today for some introductory comments and for really diving into and making sense of the Dust Bowl and some of the social drivers that led to that. And then reserving the time that we have on Thursday for thinking through the implications of that history for what contemporary approaches to environmental and social questions might be. And my plan for this afternoon is to share some introductory remarks to help situate us and give you some insight into how we think about environmental issues as sociologists. And then I really just want to dive into the reading and open up the floor for questions and discussions. Since you are coming from so many different backgrounds, I'm sure I can't anticipate the kinds of questions you have, but I'm really excited to hear them and to talk with you about what stood out to you and what kinds of questions or what kinds of things you're still thinking through after reading. So does this sound okay to everybody, this kind of plan? Okay, awesome. So to start, as a good environmental sociologist, I want to ask us to really bring our awareness to the fact that we're making use, as we meet today, of items that are only available to us as a result of the extraction and commodification of the metals and minerals necessary, for example, to manufacture computers, of trees from forests to make furniture, of the unsustainable exploitation of soils for our food and the fibers that we're wearing, and of the extraction of fossil fuel deposits for the petroleum products or plastic that's, in almost everything else around us these days. We are, as we sit in our classrooms and our offices, always surrounded by nature that's come to us from somewhere where somebody else lives and works. Most of the plastics around us will wind up in some landfill or in our waters, and will eventually break down and enter our bodies and the bodies of other living beings with many consequences. The computers we're using right now may very possibly wind up in landfills in other countries, or in so-called recycling centers, AKA, dumps, where they cause a lot of toxic pollution and where people, including kids, work in unsafe conditions to take them apart and attempt to salvage bits and pieces that might be sold. So everywhere that these things come from is or was habitat for species, including in some places humans, that's now altered indefinitely, if not permanently, so that we may, most likely in a very temporary fashion in wealthy countries, make use of them, and so that someone may profit from selling them to us and to our institutions. For these items, we're also dependent upon the labor of those who are not sitting today as comfortably as we are. Rather, they work in the mines and in the logging camps. They work in the factories to assemble these creature comforts for us, or the things that are now viewed as essential to our everyday lives and to our work. They're laboring in unhealthy and often toxic conditions, and they're generally not offered what's unfortunately the luxury rather than the right of access to educational institutions. So they don't go home to well-furnished rooms, and they're rarely asked by people in power about what they know about how the economy works, for example, at the ground level, or what they want for their communities and their future, or how they might think about resolving the ecological and social crises they confront so directly. However, without them and without the resources taken from some place someone may have once called home, we wouldn't be here today such as we are. So I highlight these points like not to be a drag or prevent us from getting to the Dust Bowl, but because I think they lead to some of the critical questions the best and most reflexive scholars and teachers might ask about the purpose of our work in this historical moment, and perhaps what we might want to accomplish through opportunities to meet like this today. So even as we sit here, we're living one of the core insights sociologists have developed from the 1800s till today. That is that we are embedded in a set of social and ecological relations that are shaped by inequalities in power and wealth, by violent histories and ongoing practices of racialized expropriation and exploitation and dispossession that are part and parcel of the history of capitalist development. So we can see this today when political and business elites don't seem to flinch as they impose policies that are well documented to inflict harm on communities and ecosystems. We can see it in the fact that indigenous peoples defending their lands are still murdered with impunity, especially when they get in the way of extractive forestry, mining, and other so-called development projects. So you've probably seen reports coming out from the United Nations in the past few years just about how many earth and land protectors are being killed each year. Now, on the other side of all of this, our social and ecological relations are also shaped by those who have worked hard to protect the land and water, just like those people who are being killed. These relations are shaped by people who have worked hard to protect our communities and to restore ecological systems and extend democracy and justice in our society. So we really need to remember, learn from, and build upon those efforts. They're very critical. And I think we have a duty to ensure our students are aware that we should never take for granted those times and places where some of us have access to relatively clean water, air, and food. A lot of that was very hard won and is still a struggle for many, even in this very extremely wealthy country, right? So finally, these relations that I'm talking about are also shaped by the incredible persistence of life and living systems on the planet that obviously, and some of you know this much better than I do, evolved on this planet well before our relatively young species. So the fact that all of these relationships we live out every day are not immediately obvious to all of us or very easy to grasp, and the fact that they're sometimes deliberately obscured or difficult to understand in their particular causes and effects, or in their relationship to individuals, organizations, and institutions, and social systems. All of this provides sociologists the material that we study, teach, and share with broader publics. So I brought my sociological lens to the question of the Dust Bowl and worked on the article you read, and then a book project, which I'm going to share a few slides with you now. Can everybody see that okay? Okay, great. So I worked on these projects. The research that you read for today is a part of it, but I worked on these for a few different reasons that I wanted to share. So first of all, I went back to it because, like many other scholars and scientists, I think there's a lot we need to learn from this period. Even if we are not confronted with the crisis of global warming, there would still be a lot to learn. However, as a consequence of the multiple and intersecting crises we have today and how they mirror the crises of the 1930s Dust Bowl, the Dust Bowl has become one of the most prominent reference of the climate change era. So some of you probably teach this in class, but for anyone for whom this is new, I wanted to share a little bit of the science. So when I decided to work on this project, I was reading the studies of climatologists who were saying that earlier projections had been too conservative and that the impacts of global warming, especially with the respect to the way it's shifting the water or hydrological cycle, were going to be more intense sooner than originally projected, and that this would have devastating effects. So when I was working on this earlier, NASA came out and said that the shift in the Earth's hydrological cycle associated with climate change is one of the most serious Earth policy issues confronting society. Another group of scholars said at the global level, the single greatest water impact generated by fossil fuels comes from their combustion and subsequent climate change, which will have major long-term impacts on water availability across the planet. I was also following Richard Seeger's work at the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory at Columbia University that showed climate change was essentially speeding up the water cycle, making wet places get wetter and dry places drier. One of the studies that really made what I think was an appropriately enormous impression on me was their study, this group of scholars that Seeger works with, of what these changes in the Earth's hydrological cycle meant for the Southern Plains and the Southwest. So Seeger and his collaborators generated projections indicating that the levels of aridity seen in the 1950s multi-year drought or the 1930s Dust Bowl would become the new climatology by mid-century, a perpetual drought. So having known something about the impact of the Dust Bowl, this really blew me away, and I have to say, like, terrified me. And while areas in the United States will be hard hit, this is obviously a global reality with enormous life and death, geopolitical and existential consequences. So given the broader recognition of the threat of drought, both in original Dust Bowl states and around the world, interest in the Dust Bowl has grown enormously in the past 10 years. So you see scholars and journalists focused on the Plains region in the US, as well as how these issues are manifest around the world. And so you see articles in some of the top science journals, including this one by Joseph Romm, which I cite in the article that you read for today. You see scholars working together across disciplines to think about what are the policy lessons, what can we learn from the Dust Bowl era science, what do we need to do basically to prepare for this new future that looks too much like this past. You have also have, like I said, a particular focus on the Plains region. So this is a study that just came out a few months ago, showing that dust levels in the original Plains region are rising again because of unsustainable agricultural practices and aridification. You see popular outlets reporting on this kind of research. So this is like in the Smithsonian Magazine and the Guardian. You also see, this is an article just from a few weeks ago in Massachusetts, WBUR. You see articles thinking about how we can understand the future of mega drought going back to the 1930s. You also have like foreign policy journals starting to look at what all of this means for conflict and migration around the world. And obviously lots of people are really interested and concerned about what all of this means for agriculture and for feeding people, because a lot of the areas that are being affected are some of our biggest growing regions around the world. So It's an important topic, and probably because of what I study, it seems like the Dust Bowl's everywhere these days. However, as I read news studies and news articles, one of the things that really struck me in a lot of the more recent narratives of the Dust Bowl was how removed they were from any social or economic history, any sociology, any real deeper explanation of what was happening and why. I didn't see strong explanations for the timing or why there have been these particular inflection points historically. I didn't see a sense of how what's happening in the US was connected to broader developments in the world, especially looking at the contemporary studies that look back at the Dust Bowl period. There's no sense of power relationships, like who gets to decide and why. There was also no sense of like who benefited from the status quo and what the barriers were to acting on these issues sooner to avoid such tragedy. There also wasn't any sense that we've had adequate science to address a lot of these things for a long time. The problem hasn't been a lack of science, foresight, technology, or know-how. The main barriers to change have really been social, not technological. So I think this is a really critical point in our discussion about environmental issues, past and present. If we don't address the question of the kinds of social change we need if we really want ecological change on the scale our scientists say is necessary, then all our research and know-how won't mean enough. Though because of it, we will better understand in ever more sophisticated and specific detail just how bad we've let things go, how many opportunities we've missed at critical junctures. So finally, I took up the question of the Dust Bowl because I'm actually from that region. And a lot of the people and places I love are there. And I'm worried about it, just as I'm sure you all are concerned about places and people that you love in the face of climate change and other ecological crises. However, also because I grew up there and because of what I study and teach, I became very aware when reading about the Dust Bowl of how the images of this period that scholars and journalists have in mind tend not to reflect the deeper history of people living there, their experience, and just what's happened over time. So as you read for today, I think this is a major problem in Dust Bowl scholarship and journalism. So most of the images people tend to have in mind when they think about the Dust Bowl look something like this. And you all have probably seen a lot of these images in different places and times. I just put a lot of them together here. So in other words, the people are all white. And this is a major problem for our understanding of the Dust Bowl. It's also a major problem for understanding how the politics and economic practices of treating some people and some places as disposable, sacrificial, exploitable, and so on are related. So I grew up in a town called Okmulgee, Oklahoma, which is about 30 minutes south of Tulsa. And it's kind of, I put a map here in case not everybody was familiar with the Dust Bowl. But I grew up in probably in the eastern edge of the Dust Bowl region in this kind of yellow, little yellow place on the map here. So Okmulgee is the capital of the Muskogee Nation. It also has a very strong Black community and the longest running all Black invitational rodeo in the United States. It's also a former oil boom town that, even though there are still some active wells, pretty much busted like they all eventually do. The town of Okmulgee, while it boasts low property taxes, doesn't have the capacity to ensure residents basic services like clean and safe drinking water. The Environmental Working Group organization reports that the town's water has unsafe levels of at least 9 contaminants, several of them carcinogens. The Muskogee tribe's investment in the schools also hasn't been enough to make up for the state's and the nation's divestment from education and social services. So in my former high school, very few kids graduate meeting basic standards for reading and math proficiency. Oklahoma schools in general rank amongst some of the worst funded and worst performing in the country. In my town, the majority indigenous, Black, and poor white students are denied basic literacies afforded kids growing up elsewhere. And a lot of the classes, like I said, that you all teach, for example, and what we offer at Amherst College, would have been completely unrecognizable to me as a kid. And they would be completely unrecognizable to kids there today as options for things that we might actually learn about in school. So all of this divestment and the lack of basic social protections, economic opportunities, and environmental protection has real life and death consequences. And I know you all teach about a lot of this in your classes. But Oklahoma has one of the lowest life expectancies in the United States. And the town of Oklahoma, not very far from where I grew up, called Stillwell, has the lowest life expectancy of any other place in the entire country. So people there live on average to only about 56 years old, and about 40% of people living in that town are members of the Cherokee Nation. So despite all of the divestment and the scale of social need in the state, as well as the clear need for resources devoted to cleaning up the environment and restoring ecosystems, the governor of Oklahoma just a few days ago announced that the state legislators would pass yet another tax cut for corporations. The state said, as he said, needs to be even more business friendly. So these cuts will reduce the state resources even further. The denial and the neglect in Oklahoma of the basic needs of communities there, and the denial of the costs of lax environmental protection, is mirrored throughout the Dust Bowl states in the denial by state policymakers of the future of the region in the face of global warming. So given the horror and the human tragedy of the 1930s Dust Bowl, you would think that our society, and these states in particular, would summon all of our forces to avoid repeating such ecological and social devastation. And yet, not only are we repeating mistakes of the past on a larger scale, but the people with the power and capital to do so are ensuring that places like the original Dust Bowl region can't protect themselves from disaster. There are about 15 states in the United States right now trying to make it illegal to even learn about the history of race and settler colonialism in the United States. So it's for all of these reasons, really, that I do the work that I do, and that I care about the issues that I care about, and that I'm very much looking forward to kind of hearing your thoughts about all of it. So I just wanted to give you this little bit of background and some introductory comments just to let you think about things a little bit the way I do. And but right now I would love to just open things up for questions and conversation.
I have a question.
Great.
Oh, sorry, I didn't raise my hand.
That's fine.
Okay. I was wondering, so one thing that I kept thinking about as I was reading about this is the farmers' protests that are going on in India. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you know anything about that, or so I was just wondering what connections you see between what happened here and what's happening there now.
Yeah, so I don't know all of the details about the farmer protests in India. Maybe do you have a quick summary, anything you'd like to share? I do know that they're trying to pass, the Modi government is trying to pass a law that in my understanding, removes the price floor that has been guaranteeing at least some bare minimum of livelihood in rural areas. Is that right, Annie? Okay. And so, I mean, I think that what you have happened, I mean, there's several things, it actually makes me think about a number of things, but I think one of the things you see happening in India, I don't know how familiar everybody is with this, but they've had a long history of farmer struggle in that country, right? So it's one of the few countries, you might have heard of like Vandana Shiva and some of the activists and movements there that tried to keep GMOs out of the country, and have really worked hard to basically put in place those minimum protections that farm workers have had. And we're not talking about rich farmers, right? We're talking about people who have been still, even with those basic protections, have really been affected by the whims of the market in the past 20 years. I don't know, you all might have heard like in the early 2000s, the spate of farmer suicides in India because of what was happening in agricultural regions there. So India, like other places, is also dealing with the effects of climate change. Things are getting tighter for farmers. There's been a lot of land grabbing, like other things going on in rural areas, making it more difficult for people to stay in their villages. Like I said, I'm not an expert on India, but I think that the struggles that farmers have there are mirrored in a lot of other places, but India in particular, given the way it was impacted going way back by the Green Revolution and the way that all was brought to that part of the world, which brought a lot more reliance on pesticides and herbicides coming from other countries that farmers couldn't afford, put them in a debt crisis that's been ongoing. These protections were meant to help them with that a little bit. And now the Modi government, like a lot of other reforms that government has been trying to implement, is very, it's unthinkable for rural areas what would happen if that passed. So the fact that people are protesting, it does remind me a little bit about the populist uprisings in the United States in agrarian regions. Farmers have always protested and fought, obviously, like everybody, for their livelihoods. I think what's going on there, if they don't have a change in government, is just going to get more intense and worse, especially as climate change increases pressure on rural areas.
Thank you. Sorry, I know that was sort of.
Yeah, and if anyone else knows more about India, it would be great if someone else would like to chime in.
I have a question. So first of all, one of the things that really stood out to me from your article was calling this like a white man's burden, when clearly other racial groups had burdens placed on them, abuses relating to this crisis. And this is just partially my own ignorance. It seemed to me that I had a good understanding of, how indigenous people were displaced or, from this land. But could you speak to how, for example, the Black population was harmed in Dust Bowl? I just don't have the historical knowledge of that.
Yeah, and people, I know that there was somebody that wanted, I met someone one time, an environmentalist historian, that wanted to write a book about that, because there's not a good compendium, a good history actually written on that topic yet. So you have to kind of piece together things from various sources to try to get a sense of like different kinds of histories to try to understand what was happening during the Dust Bowl. But I want to talk about that, but I also want to talk about the phrase, the white man's burden, that might be unfamiliar to a lot of people. So that phrase actually refers to, this was in common usage during the colonial period. And I would encourage everyone to read Rudyard Kipling's famous poem called The White Man's Burden, that was really encouraging the US to expand imperially in this time. But the white man's burden was a phrase used by elites to talk about the burden of civilizing the rest of the world. So that it was the white, and environmentalism and dealing with conservation actually came to be seen by a lot of people as another white man's burden. But it was a heavy, part of their kind of broader noblesse oblige to the world to teach proper environmental stewardship and to be stewards of the land as masters of the world, basically. So that phrase wasn't referring to the burden on particular like white farmers. It was referring to the burden of white elites of this, what they saw as their civilizing mission. Obviously, it was all self-justificatory and they were making a lot of money through these processes, but that's what that term means. So in the impact on Black farmers, you all probably know, like after the Civil War, Black farmers really, there was never any real land, redistribution program. The whole 40 acres and a mule never happened. And so you had the peak of Black farm ownership in the United States happens around the 1920s. And obviously a lot of the pressures that came to bear on all farmers during this region, even before the Dust Bowl, were especially acute for Black farmers who were denied access to credit, who were denied regular support through the USDA. So you all might have seen there's been a case working its way through the USDA on the discriminatory practices against Black farmers over a century. And so, yeah, the Dust Bowl, my understanding is that there was a lot of, loss of land, economic impact, and then barriers to receiving government assistance that was more widely available to white farmers. Lizette?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, because one of the things I always think about is about the Homestead Act. The government was giving out free land, but the government didn't give out free land fairly to everyone. That's one of the slides you showed was all white farmers. There were no Black farmers. I didn't see any Black farmers in any of the images of the Dust Bowl. And it's just, I always think about, the Blacks had been emancipated in the 1860s, and that's around the Homestead Act time, but they weren't given any free land. And it's just the government gave out free land very unfairly. Mm-hmm. And that's something that you just mentioned, yeah.
Yeah, it's an important point. And there's also, in Oklahoma, it doesn't show up in those images of the Dust Bowl, which is one of the things that's always bothered me about. And I've always wondered whether those photographers weren't being strategic in their depictions and trying to win public support, especially white public support for New Deal programs. So a lot of those images that were taken, I think, were intentionally meant to show like who were considered to be the deserving poor. And so I think a lot of that white imagery really comes from that. But one of the things that most people a lot of people anyway, outside of Oklahoma might not know, even though I will say it is on the front page of the New York Times website today, the history of the Tulsa race massacre and what happened to what used to be called the Black Wall Street, which I know one historian, Melissa Stuckey, has called Tulsa the most important center for Black life outside of Harlem in the United States, because Oklahoma was also a destination after the Civil War for Black communities that were trying to escape the South. And so Okmulgee, the town where I grew up, is actually in a ring of what were historically all Black towns, and really strong, independent, economically thriving communities with agricultural land. But Lizette, you're right, they didn't have the same support that white farmers did for a lot of their work, but what their power really came from building these independent communities outside of white control. But obviously in the state of Oklahoma, the white community was very threatened by this. And the whole history of the Tulsa massacre, which is being discussed right now in Congress because it's the 100-year anniversary of it, is really interesting and important. That's why another reason those images should not be all white of the Dust Bowl, or the way that we think about it, even if that's how, they were doing that for some purpose back during that time period. Mike?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, with the Homestead Act, not only was it the land not given out freely or equally, fairly, was it really their land to give out? Referencing in the article there, how they used the Dawes Act to just basically tell the indigenous people, like, yeah, you don't really exist. This is all ours, and we're going to give it out.
Yeah, definitely. And there's one error in the article. I don't know if you all saw it, that made it through the proofreading. It was just a typo completely, but the 1871 Act, it says the Dawes Act is listed twice in the article, but the 1871 should have been the Indian Appropriations Act that dissolved at least the federal government was dissolving tribal sovereignty in its approach to dealing with the tribes. And so, yeah, you're right. So this is the entire issue, is like, yeah, whose land was it? And you all might have noticed that there has been a big Supreme Court case that was just decided in the past year, that the McGirt decision. I would really encourage you all to read about that. It's raising so many interesting issues, because the Supreme Court ruled that actually the government never had the legal right to dissolve the Muskogee Creek Nation. And so this has implications for the other tribes in eastern Oklahoma. But basically, if you follow the implications through to their logical conclusion, half of the state of Oklahoma is actually indigenous, sovereign indigenous territory. This is causing huge waves of just apoplexy in the state. And so anyway, but it's super interesting just for thinking about ongoings, lands claims, and the land back movement and so on. Leslie? And then Michelle.
Hi, thanks so much for this piece. It's just, I sort of had my whoa moment when you said the decimation of the land requires the domination of peoples. Like that to me was really pivotal as I'm trying to understand these connections between capitalism and colonialism and the climate crisis. And then as you're getting more into like the early 1900s history, I can't help but think of the eugenics movement and these parallel tales, parallel histories maybe. And you know, I think sort of what you just said about how like the white man's burden was civilization and conservation. But I can't help wonder how, and I know they justify it because of profit, but how did they justify white supremacy when clearly they're destroying soil, right? Like just the soil erosion stuff is so just earth-shattering to me. No, I did not mean that pun. And I apologize, I'm not that corny. No, in all seriousness, it's like how, and I know this may be an unanswerable question, but like given the eugenics movement that's running side by side with this, how could they spin it so that this was a good thing? Is it just capitalism? Is it that base? Or I'd love your take on the intersection of the eugenics movement.
Yeah, so I expand on that actually more in my book because that was such a big part of the conservation, the early conservation movement, and comes directly out of the science of race that develops as in part to justify colonialism, right? This is a big part of probably all of the disciplines that we teach in today were part of this history, including sociology, biology, like ecology, and so on, promoted these racist ideas. But yeah, that's one, the point you brought up, Leslie, is super interesting to me because it's one of the things that made this book that I found, that I cite in the article from that time period, from the 1930s, so interesting, The Rape of the Earth. Now, if you read that book, it's actually would be super interesting probably for some of your students just to see how these soil scientists, I feel like they were so straightforward because they were so committed to the colonial project and there was so no questioning of the racism. And so they're really in an honest, being very honest in ways that I feel like today people have a harder time being, like just acknowledging what their commitments are and their commitments to not to the status quo, but they're very honest about it. So they're really trying to puzzle through just that question. They're saying like white dominance basically can't survive. Like we can't maintain control of this land if we can't do something about it. And that was one of their major anxieties. That's why they called it another white man's burden. You know, they said the white man's burden was as much coming to terms with the land as coming to terms with the natives. So their explanation is that, yeah, we were just concerned with expansion, territorial control, the economy before we really, and they were very open about the fact that, yeah, we have generated crises all around the world. And so that's really where the conservation movement comes in. It's the white elite response to this is a disaster we're causing, but then at the same time, they reinforce white supremacist ideas by saying like, we're the only ones that can solve it, obviously, right? And so that all of that language is so, it's not a left-wing interpretation, that's actually just what they said and how they talked about it. And so it's super interesting to go and read, and I think it's also real important. And then the eugenics, I think everyone cannot learn enough about that history because of how some ideas, I think, from that time continue to inform certain strands of environmentalism and focus on population in certain places and things like that. But, you know, like Madison Grant, who was the big friend of Roosevelt, wrote a book that inspired Hitler, you know, and he was one of the major early figures in conservation. I just think all of that history is just super important. I'm glad you brought, does that answer your question or get it? Okay.
No, I appreciate it so much. Thank you.
Okay, great. Michelle?
Hello. I've always wondered why the image of the Dust Bowl has always been these poor white settlers, especially women and children, where I was just kind of wondering, were there any Black farmers in the area at all? Did it impact American Indians at all? And then wondering in terms of what did happen. So we have a history of what happened to the white farmers and aid that was available to them. But what did happen to the few farmers that were, African American in the region? What did happen to the American Indians? Because I'm not finding a lot of literature on that. So can you elaborate a little bit more about that? And my second question was, do you think it was just pure ignorance on the part of the white settlers? Because I'm reading on page 238, and it says, hold on. The Homestead Act of 1862, and ignorance on the part of settlers who were misled by unsuitable government policies, encouraging a system of agriculture which could not be both permanent and prosperous. Do you think white settlers were encouraged to take on this task with the idea of like they were saving, bringing in their own maybe Christian beliefs into the area, cultivating the land properly, and they were doing a good thing and not really understanding the science of the soil for what they were about to do as farmers? Do you think they were encouraged? I think it was just plain ignorance that led to that happened to them?
Yeah, so I think one of the things it's important to remember is that a lot of the people working on the land didn't have a lot of option. Like there was a lot of what they called suitcase farmers in this newly open territory that, went and bought land as an investment and then hired tenant farmers to work the land. But these tenant farmers they didn't have a lot of options in terms of the kind of cultivation that they engaged in. They were under a lot of economic pressure to just, produce everything they could in a given year or lose their tenancy. And they lived in very narrow margins. They eked out a very difficult living and often times in this period. And so a lot of the landowners didn't want to invest in what it would take to engage in more sustainable practices. And so it's hard to say, like, another thing that I learned, like doing a lot of this research, is that we've been dependent on agriculture for 10,000 years as a species, right? It's not like people haven't had to deal with erosion and land degradation in the past. In fact, if you go back even to like ancient antiquity, in almost every culture in the world, there are texts that talk about how communities can live without undermining the sort of what we would think of as their ecological basis of their existence. So in all kinds of historical texts, like people are, developing ways of relating to the land, so that people could stay in place and survive over long periods of time. So it's hard to say how much individual farmers knew or didn't know, but if you go back and read the publications of the time, like all the farm periodicals, the bulletins that were coming out from the government, there was a lot of information about soil science, about soil erosion, about how to manage crops so that to deal with erosion. But I think for a lot of those suitcase farmers, it's like they could just drive the farmers to produce as much as they could. And then if the land was worn out, they could just move on and buy another plot of land. It was cheap at different points. And so I think that's one of the problems, and all of the economic pressures just overrode the other incentives to maintain. Like if you don't have any connection to the land, don't need to stay there, don't need to live on it for a long time, and don't need to survive on it, you exploit it and then you leave. And I don't think the tenant farmers can make much decision. And on the question of what happened to other people in that region, there's a good book. I'll think of the title of it, that dealt with like what happened in particular with the tribes and the New Deal. And I'll just have to think of it and come back to you. But like I said earlier, there's not a lot written about specifically like related to the Dust Bowl and Black farmers, but people are starting to publish articles on that question. So anyway, I'm happy to share some resources, but there's not a good story that I have put together about what happened, except for my understanding, like I said, that they were excluded from government programs. They experienced the pressures that other farmers did in the region, but just didn't have access to the same support to deal with them that white farmers did.
Thank you.
Katrina?
Hi. So I do some work with my students on ancient Mesopotamia and like the engineering of like the ziggurat, and we also look at Egypt and the Shaduf. And I've been trying to find some research on like the first big problem in that river valley, and like I'm wondering if you have some information on it, and like because it's known as like the first big like climate crisis, and like what happened with the Babylonians, and did the drought lead to the social upheaval, or like it has to be integrated in some way as well. And then I started reading about like volcanic eruptions and how the layers of soil were stratified in a different way, and it was really confusing for me. So I was wondering if you have any information on it.
Unfortunately, I don't have any expertise on ancient Mesopotamia, but I would love to learn about it too. I think it sounds like you need a good environmental history. But I could definitely, if you like send me your email, I work with some environmental historians. I could ask them, and I'm happy to share what they tell me, because I think I have one colleague in particular that I think might know the answer to that.
Thank you. That would be so helpful.
I'll put my email in the chat right now. I don't know if you all already have it, but I'm happy, yeah, to help. I ask my colleagues things like this all the time when I'm looking up something specific. So any resources I can share or get from someone I know, I'm happy to help with that.
Thank you.
Other thoughts or questions? Leslie?
I'm sort of taking it in another direction now. I appreciated in your opening remarks how you talk about the social and ecological relations and, you know, the accumulation of wealth, the violence, the racial capitalism that's happening. But then you also acknowledge the land and water protectors who've restored ecological systems, who are restoring democracy. And that's a rule in my curriculum, in my pedagogy, that if I'm talking about oppression, I have to talk about resistance movements. I just am done talking about oppression without finding the resistance movements to accompany it. It's too depressing. And there's enough depressing crap in the world. So I'm wondering, you know, just if you can sprinkle us with some concrete examples of who are your go-to people, either present day or 20th century, who represent these kind of protectors and these restorative, transformative people or groups.
Yeah. So I'll tell you about one place in particular that I've been very inspired by. I'm inspired by a lot that's happening in the United States, obviously the uprisings of last summer, how that's shifted the conversation, even though there's a lot of backlash and reaction, where the things that we're talking about today in policy and in educational settings and so on is just completely, it's a far cry from where we were a couple of years ago and talking about race, mass incarceration, history of the United States, and so on. Obviously, there is a lot that needs to be done, but I'm inspired by a lot. I'm inspired by Black Lives Matter. I've been inspired by the Sunrise Movement too, the youth movement, and how many young people are becoming active and also making connections between social and racial justice, redressing historical oppression, reparation, and environmental protection. Varshini Prakash, who is one of the co-founders of that movement, was actually a student of mine in one of my environmental movements class. And like the stuff that they're doing, I think is really inspiring, especially for young people. And you all are working with young people like I do. And it's like, the things that they're talking about are important. I still think that they are grappling with the historical whiteness of the environmental movement and how to make more connections to things that a lot of especially the co-founders care about. And so anyway, all those developments are really inspiring to me. And the youth movement internationally is actually inspiring to me. I was in Germany giving a talk, and some of the young people there who are dealing with the rise again in Germany of white supremacy and neo-Nazi. It's very scary, and also a kind of right-wing environmentalism. But I met all of these young activists that were so on top of things, like just in terms of German history and where they were really trying to push environmentalism and bring racial justice and transnational solidarity into their work. So that was really inspiring. There's a group of activists in the Indian Ocean region and in Eastern African countries that are coming together that I got to meet and talk to a few years ago that I stay in touch with. They're based in Mauritius. And I don't know, it's a place that we don't hear a lot about in this part of the country. But I have to say, one of the things they're doing, I think we could learn from a lot in the United States. They have a meeting every year that brings organizations together from all of the countries on the east coast of Africa, from Madagascar, from all of the islands in that region. They study together, run a school together, and then talk across all their different organizations to set priorities for their activism together for the year, kind of moving forward. And they're people in they're bringing together organizations that do like they're bringing trade unions, environmental organizations, farmer organizations, like women's rights organizations, and all of these local groups, and then these bigger international groups like Via Campesina and MST based in Brazil, the Landless Peasants Movement. Anyway, so there's things like that where people are starting to talk across national borders and to think more regionally about how to have an impact and coordinate action. And I think some of the way I see that happening in the United States, or the one place where I see that kind of cross-sector organizing, is in the Green New Deal Network and the Thrive Agenda, like organizing around the Thrive Agenda. Have you all heard of this? Oh, I want to see if I have it with me right in front of me. So I'm going to put this in the chat if I can. It looks like, well, didn't allow me to. I can, so I would look up the Thrive Agenda letter. So there are a lot of different groups, including the Movement for Black Lives, Indigenous Environmental Network, SEIU, the AFT. There are all faith groups, a lot of different environmental groups that have actually gotten together since Biden was elected to try to push for an agenda that promotes both environmental justice, ecological restoration, and racial justice, and reinvestment in communities. So I would definitely check out that Thrive Agenda and the organizing happening around that. I think I've not seen, I'll be honest, and maybe you all know more than I do, but I haven't seen in my lifetime that kind of list of groups of people getting together. Like New York City is different. It's unusual. There's, it's a metropolitan area, and people can get together to build coalitions in a kind of temporary way for certain things, and then they disband. But this is organizations spread out across the country. And I don't know, I'm inspired by that. So I would definitely check that out. Other questions or thoughts?
We have time. Oh, go ahead, David. Yeah, I was going to say we have time for at least one more question. So jump in, David.
Thanks. So I guess I was just wondering, thinking about, what you're saying in terms of what these groups now are pushing for. Like, what were the big, if you were to, go to the organizations that were sounding the alarm about dust-bowlification or that risk in the late 1800s, early 1900s, like, what were their asks that, maybe we look back on now and say, dang, we wish that would have happened? Mm-hmm. Or what were their asks in general, I guess?
Yeah, so are you thinking about, so there were not environmental organizations the way we think of as like environmental organization. If you're looking at some of the big conservation organizations, like they definitely were pushing for more regulation of soil use and things like that, and more education for farmers, more resources available to farmers, restrictions on this absentee ownership of farmland, so that you didn't have the situation where people could just buy up land, you know, basically obliterate it and then, you know, move on. And so I don't know that they were in the same, I don't know that they were asked quite like we envision them in the environmental movement today or in the environmental justice movement today, but there were definitely a lot of policy proposals and ideas and things that people were writing about. But it's a good question. Like, I don't know, like if the populist, like kind of agrarian movement, I'm not sure what they thought about specific policies to address soil erosion. It's a good question. I should do some research into that, because I actually don't know like whether they had that component as part of their platform. I do know that in the kind of internationally, in the more like international workers movement, that there were people like even Karl Marx and Frederick Engels like writing about land degradation and what capitalist agriculture was doing, and saying that we needed to have more protections for communities so they couldn't continue to enclose land, push people out of push people out of rural areas into cities, and that would have an effect on the land too, because moving everybody into cities was resulting in, you know, all of these fiber and food that used to stay on the farm or in rural areas getting shipped to cities and becoming waste. So I know that they were aware and talking about it, but it's a good question. I'm not sure what they're like specific, how they formulated specific asks around like that kind of policy question of like, what do we do about erosion?
Thanks, yeah.
Well, yeah, thank you. And with that, I hate to say that we're out of time. I feel like in a lot of ways our conversation is really just beginning, and I'd like it to just keep going, because I'm thinking, among other things, about something that I hadn't really thought about before, which is that a culture of mobility that we've sort of created as part of our national myth is something that inherently incorporates in it a lack of connection with the land, the kind of connection with the land that gives you a motivation to protect it and steward it. And so these are fascinating questions. And so I'm at least grateful that if we can't continue long into the evening, we'll be able to continue on Thursday. So I'd like to thank all of you for being here, and Hannah Holleman especially for really beginning this really rich and disturbing and powerful conversation with us.